world's writers will walk through those gates. And if you hang around, you get a chance to talk to them.
I'm interested in conversations that deal with things that matter, but real, how do we live our lives?
First of all, make climate change personal in your life. The second step is get angry and get active. And the third step, and believe it or not, I think this is the most important. We have to imagine this world that we want to hurry towards.
It's about kindness is looking at people as people and not as I voted this, I do this, whatever it is. There are some people we will never get along with, but most of us are a complex mass of different things.
Hello, I'm Ian Rankin. I've been with the Edinburgh International Book Festival basically since day one. I went as a student, as a reader, as a fan of writing. Later on, I was invited to go as an author, which was a thrill. And it's a spectacular experience. It's a meeting of minds. It's a way to open your mind to new experiences, to new ideas, nuanced debate, entertainment, something for every age group. And that's what keeps me going back year after year after year. Long may it continue.
Welcome, good evening, and thank you for joining us for this incredible event with Maaza Mengiste about The Shadow King, which is a novel set in Ethiopia 1935. With the threat of Mussolini's army looming, recently orphaned Hirut struggles to adapt to her new life as a maid. Her new employer, Kidain, an officer in Emperor Haile Selassie's army, rushes to mobilize his strongest men before the Italians invade. The Shadow King is a powerful exploration of female power and what it means to be a woman at war. And it is my absolute pleasure to introduce the incredible Maaza Mengiste, who's going to be talking to us about this wonderful, wonderful novel, this very deeply affecting novel, the way that it was crafted over a long, long, wonderful period of time. And yes, welcome, Maaza. How are you doing?
Thank you. It's good to be here. It's really good. Thank you.
I would love to start by just asking you to introduce the book a little bit and to tell us a bit about your personal and your family connection to this incredible story.
Yeah, well, you gave a brief overview of the book, but in essence, the book is set in 1935, and the backdrop is Mussolini's invasion of Ethiopia in an attempt to colonize the country. I've always been interested in this war, partly because this conflict with Italy, and also the conflict that preceded it, which was 40 years back, the first time Italy tried to colonize Ethiopia. These were stories that I grew up on, living in Ethiopia. Every family gathering I had, there was some way that this war was mentioned. Either a friend of my grandfather's would walk into the house and somebody would say, oh, he was a commander of this army, or he did this at this time. On my father's side, there were men who fought, his brothers fought. And I knew this story. It wasn't just history, it was family. It was my family who went to the front lines. So if you can imagine that this was 1935, Ethiopia was not militarily advanced, and they were confronting one of the most technologically advanced militaries in the world at that time. And Ethiopia 5 years later won. They defeated them, with outdated rifles and spears. And it was an illogical win in many cases. And that was also something that captured my child's imagination. How was that possible? How could this happen? I grew up being very proud of this history, but I grew up with that question of how did they do it? I became interested in trying to find out more about this. And from that interest, came this book. But, as I think I thought I was researching and locating the stories of the men who fought in my family, from my father's side, from my mother's side. Those are the stories that I heard. I didn't realize until much later in the research that women were there not only as caregivers, but as women, as soldiers. And then much, much, much later, once I had found out some information which completely turned the book around, and I began to rewrite this book centering women, it wasn't until I was almost done with that my mother casually mentioned to me, don't you remember your great-grandmother also fought in this? And I had no idea. No one had ever told me that. And my mother, I had asked her at some point, why didn't you tell me? You could have saved me years of research if I knew my great-grandmother had fought and I met her before she passed away. And my mother said, well, you never asked. And I think that was also very telling for me, that we don't automatically assume that there are voids in the history that we hear. We don't just make that assumption when we're listening to people tell stories, when we're reading history books. We don't assume that there are voids. And I really think that has to be a natural assumption for every single person who hears any part of history.
And that's one of the reasons why I love historical fiction so much, because the history that you learn at school, it's very scripted. It's very, I suppose, intentional for what you're supposed to learn. And we're never really, as school children, we're not really instructed to look for those gaps or question why there are people who aren't mentioned in this chapter over the people who are. And historical fiction, work like your book, it invites us to look beyond what we've kind of already been told or what we expect to be the complete picture. And something that I found really, really interesting in The Shadow King is the way that you challenge us to rethink not only the idea of who's missing from history, but the way that we celebrate history as well, and how we celebrate people who we might consider to be war heroes. And you bring to the center these women who were warriors in this period. And on first glance, it might feel like what you're saying to us is we have to also celebrate these women. But on the other side of the coin, you've got this other story. You've got this other way that we need to be acknowledging the cost of participating in war that includes women warriors as well, who weren't blemish-free. And I was just wondering if there is a message you're trying to tell us as readers with this hidden history in this book.
Yeah, now is a good time. Maybe we can bring up one of the images that we have for this talk. This is something that I found, during research. It's an image that's readily available online. And in terms of the way that it celebrates, on one hand, it celebrates women. This is a photograph that clearly centers women. You see them with the guns. these women existed. I think most of them have been identified. They fought in the war. But then there is this other reality. And when I look at this image, one of the things that I see here is, speaking of gaps and voids, I mean, I see the metaphorical void that is right behind them, two of them in the back there. And if I were, looking at this photograph as a writer, I would say, what's in that space that hasn't been explored yet? What is the story inside that dark spot that we haven't looked at yet? Maybe they don't want to look at it either. Their back is turned. And so I think that the reality of women in war is that they were still moving within a patriarchal, masculine endeavor as women. And that was a dichotomy that I wanted to explore, because there were some moments in history that were clearly just erased. Where, we can talk about forgotten parts of history, but then what we also need to understand that there's a difference between something that's forgotten and something that has been so erased that there is a void and we don't even know that it had ever existed. There's nothing to remember, to forget. And when I look at this, I think about what did women experience on a daily, intimate level in war? When they were expected on the battlefield, they might be soldiers, but what happens when they come back to their tents and into the camp? And it's a question that I explore with Aster and also with Hirut in a different way. Aster is the wife of a nobleman, Kidana, who was head of the military. But this marriage that had its own tensions before the war had its tensions during the war. And that doesn't end. And part of those tensions were centering around Aster wanting to be something besides a wife, which is the way that her life has been defined. And Hirut wanting to be something besides a maid to Aster. So between men and women, there are tensions. But between the women, there were tensions based on class, based on social standing. And those are the things that made this book very interesting for me to write, because I had questions, and that was why I wrote this book, not because I had answers. But the place of women is in many ways contradictory and complex, because they were fit into a system that is masculine, and they were seen through a lens that is masculine. But I wondered how they would begin to define themselves if they broke out of those parameters. What would that look like?
I love the idea of writing because you have questions. It feels sort of like the same way that I approach research writing. You don't come to it with all of the answers at all. You have to figure it out along the way. And I think that's a beautiful way to try and explore your own history as well. You have to then actively go out and find these answers and these gaps, and it's so purposeful. And then that figure who is in that void, in that black space behind those two warriors that you've pointed out, that is the character that broke and sort of molded my heart while reading this. That's Hirut, in many ways. And well, to come back to Hirut, I just wanted to ask you about the process of then exploring and writing this book, because as I know, your last book was Beneath the Lion's Gaze, which came out about 10 years ago. And so this has been about a decade-long process for you. And how has that been for you as a writer, the patience required to sit with that work and not rush yourself to finish it in sort of a much quicker time period? Or how do you get around the frustration maybe of knowing that it's still not done yet? You've just got that new information about your grandma. You have to rethink all of this because this isn't the book that is the finished version that you want. I suppose if there are people watching who are writers who are kind of dealing with that sort of the pressures of time, or feeling like there needs to be a very distinct start and end period when writing a novel, or like a particular time scale versus this 10-year period that you sat with? What kind of advice would you give to them, and how did you handle that decade of working?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Maybe the first way I can answer that is, if you look right behind me, you'll see two images. There's also, I have a wall covered with photographs from the 30s and of the Ethiopian War, the war in Ethiopia. And I kept these, I still have them here. I kept them around my desk. And if you can see, this guy looks like he's staring right at me as I'm writing. He is looking over my shoulder. This young girl is looking literally over my shoulder as I'm writing. And I've often said that I wrote this story, this book, completely surrounded by ghosts. They are here. They were here. The photographs were symbolic, and so I felt in many ways that the writing of this story was an act of responsibility towards the dead, but not only to the dead, but to those who are not yet born. Because in order to understand who we are right now, we have to understand what happened before us, but what's the possibility of what could happen later if we do nothing. And I've always, archives, documentation, these are not innocent. Research is not an innocent task. It's not naive. That it is, it often has been done in a sense to continue a kind of narrative about history that creates these voids. And if we don't know how to ask certain questions, we never know that those voids exist. So I had that imperative that I need to find out. I don't know all the answers. I still don't know all the answers, but what are some of the questions that I can ask about this war? Understanding that this war can help tell us something about today in such a way that we can help prepare the world for the people who have yet to live. I think Walter Benjamin said that decades ago, that if fascism wins, not even our dead will be safe from the enemy, because the enemy will reconstruct what the dead were in order to continue a present and create a new kind of future that upholds that enemy. So I saw this task of writing as a responsibility towards the dead and the not living yet. As a way to speak to these ghosts and tell them that I'm listening. And I tell them, teach me how to hear, teach me how to listen, so I can find a way to let you, for you to be heard. I think this is one of the reasons the book took so long, but the patience that I had came because periodically, when I really thought that I would not get this done, that this book was impossible. It was an impossible task I had set myself, and I had set myself to fail. Something would happen, a small breakthrough would come. And I would say, okay, if I can do this paragraph okay, maybe I can do this page okay. So let me just do this, and then maybe this chapter might work. So it was a constant process. I mean, I think most writers will tell you, this is what creativity is. It is always running into yourself and then trying to run past yourself. You catch up with yourself, you better keep going. And that was the one thing I would always say, is this where you are, or can you go a little bit further? I don't know if you can see this. I've had this for 10 years on my desk. It's here still. It's a tiny thing.
What does it say?
It says, give yourself space to fail. And I wrote it really small because we're writers and we're ironic, right? So I put it here 10 years ago. The sticky part of it no longer works. It's just stuck in my computer. And I looked at that every day as well, because you have that act of being willing to fail means that you're always on the precipice. You're always pushing yourself to the edge. You're looking over and saying, maybe I can take a step further. And those moments, which were frightening but liberating, were part of those moments that kept me writing. But also this idea that there is no justice for the dead without a responsibility to their stories, which are our stories, which is our future. And that kept me centered, in addition to these people up here.
I mean, we could talk for ages about the concept of failure and success and what it actually means from, I suppose, a creative standpoint, but maybe I'll save that for later, because that's just such a huge topic. What we count as our personal failures and small, even if they're written really small on a piece of card. What is a small failure and what's a big failure? But I would love to just quickly go back to pick up on that word responsibility a little bit and ask you, in terms of historical fiction, there's that responsibility for a writer to bring these stories out and to do exactly as you're saying, honor the dead and those to come. Is that a responsibility that is specific to historical fiction, or do you think that's the responsibility of all writers of fiction in some way?
Well, I think it's a responsibility of writers. But it's also a responsibility of thinkers, of readers, of people who are critics. It's our engagement with texts, our engagement with art, our engagement with thoughts that sometimes may make us uncomfortable, may make us angry. Our engagement with them, I think, creates a foundation for what a possible future might look like. So it is the responsibility of writers. It is, this is a responsibility of fiction. How do we care for, how do we claim those who have gone before us and those who are yet to come? Mm-hmm. But I think for readers, it's the same. It is actually just a human responsibility. And unfortunately, we're living in a time where things have become so much centered on what's happening right now and what I can get out of my neighbor or this society or this, what advantage can I take from this moment? We've lost sight of the idea of a collectivity of a community. If this pandemic, if there's anything it's shown us, is how interconnected we are. And quite literally and quite physically, this virus connected us all. We saw how one person moving from one place to another suddenly bound groups of people together in a similar fate.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's beautiful, by the way. Thank you for that answer. And you've kind of touched on this a little bit, but I'm curious to know about this process of revising the book and updating different bits with this new lens that you were looking through this time period with. And I'm wondering, are there characters that we've read in the book, that we're reading in the book, who perhaps weren't there before, or perhaps weren't big parts of the story before? Were there concepts that you then later thought, I need to clarify and I want to shine a light on, I guess, in addition to it centering women, but in addition to that, were there ideas in the final book that maybe you hadn't focused on before in previous versions that now is kind of central to the narrative?
Yeah, I think that at a moment where I knew that I had been in the process of revising and I wasn't happy with it. I wasn't sure what was missing, but I didn't know what to do. And I was just sitting at my desk, and I do the thing that writers say, it's working, even though it doesn't look like you're working, and just staring at the ceiling. And this thought came into my head, and it said, the dead are angry and they want to be heard. And I wrote that down, and it took a moment. for me to think about, well, what does that mean? What, who, what, how, what do you mean they need to be heard? It took a few days of just sitting, ruminating on that. And then I said, oh my God, they really do want to be heard. And this is a reason that this chorus started forming, that this is this voice that demanded a space to speak. And as soon as I said, all right, here we go, take some pages, do it. It broke open the entire story. And everything, all the parameters exploded. Everything that I thought I was doing just no longer worked. And it was, I started all over again. And that's part of why it took so long, but there was an urgency to that made me think, you can't let this go. This is something that needs to happen. It worked, I think. Yeah, it worked. It took a while.
These additions of the chorus and the descriptions of the photographs, they're some of my favorite aspects of the book. You know, we get these entirely different lenses through which to see this time period and through different people's eyes. And I think that was, and also the way that the ghosts keep reappearing to the side of different characters. I thought that was absolutely stunning. And one of the, in addition to the chorus, you know, we've got these different vignettes of the photograph. And one of the characters that is quite central to the story, Ettore, he is fascinating to me, because the way that you write him, it represents, to me, the detachment between the artist and the muse. And it's very deliberate detachment to sort of dehumanize the subject in order to create your art or create your work. And I'd love for you to talk to us a bit about your intentions with the photographer and sort of what it means to the meaning of the book.
Yeah, thank you. Maybe we can put up the next photo, and then just very briefly, this is an image. It was speaking of photographs, and Ettore, this is something that I envisioned he might have taken of Hirut, which feels like a very innocent photograph. This was, I don't know who this young woman is, young girl, but I imagined Hirut like that. But if we move to the next image, you know, whereas that first image, it looks innocuous, it looks naive. You look at it and you say, there's no harm in that image. But this photograph, which was really what got me thinking about Ettore and his presence in this book, and the presence of photographers in wars, in colonial enterprises. This photograph was one that was pivotal for me, because you see the photographer's shadow quite literally. I've always thought of Ettore as someone who ruled not the light but the shadows. You know, and the title, the Shadow King, that shadow thing is also partly a nod to these people who rule the dark, who move within those places. And you see in this photograph the presence of the photographer, the fact that this is not a casual image, this is not an innocent photograph. This is a photograph that is as much, it's not about the man that's there, the East African man who's standing there. This is an image that is saying something about the Italian. The prop is the African man. He is a metaphor for their ability to stand there in front of this man on his land, in his country, and remain unharmed. And that photographer is transmitting that, but he is also directing that shot. And this photograph guided me through the scenes with Ettore, because Ettore and his camera are not innocent. The photography was used, is used, has been used as a weapon ever since it crossed the West and started moving into the global south, it has been a weapon as brutal as bullets. And these images that have been sent back from these different countries have helped to create a narrative of a certain group of people or a certain kind of history that really needed the help of the West in order to fully exist. And this image for me really spoke to that. I've stared at this for so long, but I've been collecting photographs that these soldiers took in Ethiopia, in East Africa, and in some parts of Libya as well, when they were there. And you see again and again the constructed narratives. And we don't know what all the voids are, because some of them have been so completely erased. But I do believe the photographs give us a clue.
Absolutely, I agree entirely with what you're saying about the complicity of the photographer, and we saw this really, really salient example quite recently with news reporters reporting on refugees coming across the channel and filming that. And you know, I don't know if you saw it, but that clip of one of the news reporters pointing out that their boat is sinking, and you know, instead of doing what would be humane, saying, get on my boat, you know, we've got space and this is not sinking, is to point a camera at the crisis. And there's just, I don't think that we criticize that position enough, because we have an idea that photography or filming or any kind of recording of the media is objective in some kind of way, and it isn't, because you're a person in a place with other people. And that's, Ettore for me was an amazingly interesting character. And you can tell me if I'm way off with this idea as well, but the idea of the shadow also brought me into thinking of the way that you brought in the fascism that was happening in Europe at the time as well, but it wasn't necessarily central to this story because we're in Ethiopia, but it was still there looming in the background in terms of what it meant for Ettore, what it meant for the Ethiopians and the Italians in Ethiopia. And I'm just wondering if that for you is a concept that you wanted to focus on, or if that came later, if you felt like you needed to be specific about what would then be World War II, or if you couldn't have possibly written this book without mentioning everything that was going on with Hitler and the Nazis back in Europe.
Well, you know, it's interesting that you ask that, because this war between Italy and Ethiopia is considered by many historians to be the first real battle of World War II. That what happened in Ethiopia was setting up a series of alliances that would then play out through World War II. Mussolini would eventually align with Hitler. You know, then you would have the Allied forces, Britain and France, the League of Nations that had initially said, give Ethiopia to Mussolini. We don't want him to really move over to Hitler. Let's just placate him. And so maybe he won't cause any trouble, and Italy won't make an alliance with Nazi Germany. Let's give him Ethiopia. So Ethiopia was a sacrificial lamb in this case. It didn't work out that way. You cannot appease a bully and think that he's going to do what you want. It felt necessary for me to incorporate some of that backstory. I didn't do a lot, but it was part of the framework of this. And I think Ettore is also, the one thing we could mention is he's also Italian Jewish, and his position was precarious as the war continued in Ethiopia. And I was very curious about what happens in the case of those people who were in East Africa fighting for Italy, enforcing racist segregation laws 1 year, and then the next year finding themselves victim to the same kind of racism, to anti-Semitism. How does someone negotiate those two things? What's the aftermath of all of that? Which is one of the questions I'm curious about with conflict. What happens after? And, for those who survive, which is why the book begins and ends in 1974, because I wanted to look at the consequences of all of this.
And a potential answer is that you can't negotiate fascism. There's always going to be somebody else that's in line to be oppressed. And just the way that you used these characters to make that point was absolutely stunning. And I need to stop nodding my head so much when you talk. I'm gonna give myself a neck ache, but you can tell I love this book. Maaza, I wanted to ask you a little bit about the resources that you look to when you were writing a book like this. I mean, there is so much history in there, but there's also, your own family story, and there's all these archives that you've used. And I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit about that process of resources.
Yeah, initially I was looking through archives. I lived in Rome in order to do research in the fascist archives, to look in the libraries. And the one thing I realized very quickly is that the documents that I was looking at, saved from 1935 through the 40s, were things that had been approved by the fascists. This is saved. This is why history is never neutral. The archives are never neutral. They're not innocent. And I decided early on, I want to know the story that's not told, the things that nobody wanted us to learn about. And I started speaking to friends of mine who were Italian. I started asking if I could look at family photographs, photographs from soldiers who had been based there. I went to flea markets across Italy, and every flea market I would go to, there was always a fascist table. And I would go to those tables and I would ask to see colonial era photographs. And I would, letters, diaries, anything I could find, I was looking through. And through those personal artifacts, the photographs that soldiers took when they were relaxing, when they were, joking around, sometimes, on a field, sometimes with prisoners, those photographs that didn't need to be censored because they were not going to be published in newspapers, helped me create a fuller story. Then I would talk to family members of mine. I did research in Ethiopia. I was looking for as much as I could there as well. And through that, I was piecing together some of what archives and documents may not be able to tell fully. But, speaking of resources, I have to say this, that at some point, when I was in the middle of writing this book, I was at Oxford, and I knew that a photographer that had been based in Ethiopia during the war had taken photographs and left his estate, that estate, to a museum at Oxford. And I emailed the curators because I also knew that one of my relatives, a great uncle, had been a guide of this photographer at some point. And I just was curious to see if there were any photographs taken of my great uncle. This great uncle was like my father's father, because his father had died. So he raised my father. And the man who was like his brother, my uncle, lived in the UK. And so I told him I'm going to go to this museum. And I said, I'm going to look for your father's photograph. I went there, and one of the things I told the curators, there might have been misspellings in names, which is something that it happened all the time. You see colonial records, things are misspelled, and this is how history sometimes drops through the cracks. And sure enough, through different spelling variations, I did find a photograph of my great uncle in that museum. And it was one of the more emotional moments of this whole research thing, because all of a sudden I'm looking at him and I see the army that he has around him, and I can pick out my father's brothers who have my face, who have my father's face. And I took this, the curators were very kind, and they let me have a JPEG of this image. And I showed it to my uncle, and my uncle said, he got very emotional. And he said, no one in our family, Maaza, has ever seen a photograph of my father at this age in this war. Mm. And this is family history now of mine that is in this museum at Oxford. And it constantly, history is not history. History is my family. And as soon as we start breaking down that concept of history as this huge impersonal monolith, but it's actually the stories of individuals and communities and their families, that those are human beings in those images, and that those human beings created children, and those grandchildren are walking the streets like me. It gave me a different sense of what these archives are, what history is, whose history is this? If my family photograph is in a museum and I had never seen it, and the son of that man never saw it until I went there. So it makes me think about what Walter Benjamin said, not even our dead are safe if we don't claim that responsibility to the dead, but also to the unborn. That's where the justice lies, is in the respect for them.
And how do you reconcile that placement of that image, of that history that belongs to you and your family in somewhere as far as Oxford? Is there do you know what would you like to have that image, in your own possession, for example?
I would like my uncle to have that photograph of his father, but it's not his, right? Because it was taken by a European man who then bequeathed that to a museum. And the curators were kind enough to say, any way that we can work with you, we will. And I'm very grateful for that. They, I think they understood all the complexities, but whose history is that? And who owns this? This is the story of museums with looted items. This is the story that we have got. Museums are not neutral. These are not neutral spaces. History is not neutral. But it reminds me again that what we're fighting now, all of these protests, these uprisings, they are fighting for, of course, the present, but also for a future that will be inclusive, and for a past that is recognized for the complexities and the depth that it truly contained. We're not just fighting for this moment. That's why these museums with their carefully curated narratives of history, we have to continue to talk about this and push against some of those histories.
And that's why books like yours are so vital, because they do that so brilliantly. And I'd love to bring in a couple of the audience questions at the moment that we've had, because some of them relate to kind of what we've been saying and what you've already kind of touched upon. For example, one person has asked the question, do you have any advice on researching lesser known wars? So specifically about maybe your access to those archives, how you went about, advice on how you went about getting through those walls and seeing those images and reading those words.
Yeah, I would recommend, if there's a way to speak to people who are descendants of those who lived, that is a really good way to approach that. I mean, we're living during when museums or libraries might be really hard to get to, but librarians to me are these heroic figures. They are the unsung heroes behind my book and I think almost every historical novel that's written. I send emails to them, and the kinds of information I get is beyond anything that I would imagine. So I would recommend reaching out, send emails to librarians. You'd be surprised. And I'm getting on Zoom with one tomorrow. So everybody's learning to work around some of these restrictions that we have, but speaking to people who have family stories from that time, speaking to the women who may not think that their stories are history, and yet they are. I often, what if I had spoken to my mother earlier, if I knew what to ask? Would I have received more information, you know, about my great-grandmother much earlier? So I would say talk to people, but librarians too are fantastic.
Knowing what to ask can be the first hurdle for any kind of thing. And we love librarians. So that's brilliant advice. I have a question here that asks if you could talk about the importance of memory and mourning in the novel. And the Emperor learns Simonides' memory technique at a young age, and that technique came out of remembering people's position prior to their death. It feels like every character is mourning someone or something from the past.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the idea of how we remember those who have gone before us, I mean, it's central to the book, but how we remember and how we speak of those who have passed helps to establish a collective memory. If we can sit around in a family gathering and begin to unearth stories even within our family, it strengthens the possibility. It strengthens the ways, the possibility for change within that family, within maybe eventually a community. But I really think that the ways that we speak of ourselves, which means of those who have come before us and those who will come, helps to create and develop a collective memory within humanity. And I was very invested in that, in questions of how we remember, because even Hirut, who is the central character in the book, there are things she doesn't want to remember, and the chorus comes in and says, "Wait a minute, we have to tell you this, even though she doesn't want us to, because even those things have to be spoken of."
Beautiful. Thank you, Maaza. This next audience question is asking how your book is received in Ethiopia. If you visit, and are you, I like this, are you revered as a hero for revealing this part of war?
Not quite. I think the book is not yet in Ethiopia. People have it if people bring it over when they came, but all the plans for distribution, all of that just kind of, it froze once this pandemic hit. It was impossible to get just the very tangible logistical realities of distribution happening. But I'm in talks with having it there. And I hope that there will be a launch as soon as things open up.
That's brilliant. It feels almost kind of wrong that we've got it before people in Ethiopia have had a chance to read it. So yeah. I'm excited for that process to happen for you.
Thank you.
Another person has asked, excuse me, what was something that you wanted to have included in the book but didn't end up being part of the finished version? And I think writers always have
that. Is such a good, okay, you know what? I will say this, I don't think I've ever said this before, but the book was 1,000 pages and I cut 500. So there are many, many, many things that are not in the book. Many things. I cannot think of all of them. But when it came to editing, I had to be absolutely ruthless with myself and center this book on Hirut. Everything begins in the home with every single one of these characters. It begins in the home. It doesn't go much farther than the home. Even if we're talking about war. So everything else left. And somebody said at some point, maybe you could make another book of it. like it's time to move on to book 3.
Yeah, maybe in another lifetime. I mean, it's what, 425 pages at the moment, and when I finished it, I had to lie down on the floor.
Me too, Jess, me too, trust me.
I can't imagine what we would have had to do after 1,000 pages. So maybe go on a holiday or actually fall asleep. Thank you for that question. Thank you for all the audience questions so far, by the way, everybody.
They're great.
We've got a few more, which are brilliant. This next one, it says, it seems that the notion of bodies is a very important component of your work. I'm reminded of Svetlana Alexievich, I'm so sorry if I pronounced that wrong, work, The Unwomanly Face of War, about experiences of ex-Soviet women during World War II. Could you speak more to the influence which the female body at war has had on your family and on contemporary Ethiopian women? It's a big question, I think.
Yeah, so the body, well, we can speak about, this is a whole other session. I mean, that's a fantastic question. But if we think about war, as Svetlana Alexievich's The Unwomanly Face of War is a fantastic book, and I would recommend it to anyone. Reading that book, looking at the stories of women in war, not only in my book, but historically, and we can go as far back as Homer, we can go however back. The one thing that comes up again and again is that women have always been contested territory in war. When an enemy goes into a village, goes into a city, one of the first things that they do is rape women. And they rape the women to harm the men and to destroy a kind of future that place, that location, that family, those men might imagine. And it's done through the bodies of women. The bodies of women are landscape. They're territory to be conquered, but they're also trophies to be taken. I mean, you see that in the Iliad, where Helen of Troy is renowned for her beauty, but that beauty, Paris kidnapped her, and here comes the Trojan War, and men die over this. But women have been trophies and territory. They've been camouflaged for the cruelties of men. And one of the things that I realized very quickly is when these Italian soldiers, when colonial forces, when Westerners would go into countries in the global South and photograph women in suggestive and sexual ways, it was often a camouflage for another form of violence that was happening behind the scenes with that, against that community. If a woman is being photographed naked in a place by an enemy combatant, you can imagine what else is happening to everyone else in that community and what will happen to her after that photograph is taken. So the bodies are symbols, they're metaphors, but we forget sometimes that these are human beings also. And through Hirut, I wanted to consider what happens when a body, this woman with this body that has been both territory and trophy, says, wait a minute, I'm still here. And I'm pissed. What happens then? And that's, I wanted to explore with her those stories that women don't often want to talk about.
And perhaps at this point, it's a good point to mention that there is a lot of very explicit, very visual descriptions of sexual violence against women in the book. And I think about this a lot when I read, when women have written these kinds of scenes. Were you able to sort of take care of yourself through writing those chapters and those parts of the book? Because rape is not an objective thing to write about. It's not like describing this layout of the background or the landscape. It's deeply personal. And how did you find writing those descriptions of what both Hiru and Asta and everybody else in the book sort of went through?
Yeah, it's interesting that's a really good question. And when I think back on that, I think the chorus helped me because the chorus steps in periodically. And the chorus, you know, is angry, but they're also disruptive. And they would disrupt my own process, because there were times when I might only want to focus on Hirut, or I might only want to focus on Aster. And they're like, we're going to take a look at Kidana here. We're going to take a look at this other person. Let's take a moment here, because there's somebody else in the room. And we need to consider that too. They helped, because if it were up to me, maybe those scenes would have gone differently, but I was really paying attention to these characters, but also to that chorus.
Thank you. Thank you for that, Maaza. I think that idea that there are multiple people involved is so crucial to highlight when you're talking about violence of any kind. It's all in the language, and you do that beautifully in these descriptions. We've got about 4 minutes left, and we've got a lot of wonderful questions up here, but so we might not be able to go through all of them, but the next one I'm going to swing your way, Maaza, it reads, my granddad was one of the soldiers who was there and took many photographs. I still have. I would like to tell you that he was truly sorry. He did not want to be there at all, but he had to. He always used to speak to me about the beautiful and friendly Ethiopians, the landscape, and how he felt this war was totally wrong. It's not quite a question in there, but I suppose the idea that there are people, you know, obviously, as you say, there are people still walking around who have these connections with their families to that history still, and we shouldn't forget that. I'm just looking for one with a question mark. Do you think the future of conflicts might be altered by telling these kinds of alternative stories of conflict and war, but also including the aspect of female leadership? I think this is an interesting question, because some people have referred to this book as being feminist, a feminist book, and they've sometimes respond to the idea of war and violence as saying, but if a woman was in this position, we wouldn't have these kinds of things. And sort of how do you respond to that idea of women taking up these spaces and that idea of what might be different, or would anything be different?
Well, I think that as a very, very good friend of mine, who is also a writer, brilliant writer, Mona El-Tahawi, says, you know, it's very possible for women to be foot soldiers of the patriarchy. It's very possible for women to enact the same kinds of cruelties on other women, on men, in the way that a man would. Being a woman doesn't necessarily make you automatically someone who is of the alternative, so to speak. So I think the question here is, how do we disrupt the inclinations towards aggressive conflict? What can the past teach us about war, so that we begin to understand the very complicated realities that make up war? I think we've thought of war in terms of the monuments that have been left behind, the monuments that create a kind of grandiose and very blurry, hazy sense of what conflict does and what it does to people who have been a part of it in one way or another. But if we speak of these stories of women, of what actually happens within within conflict, if we can complicate those stories, it might make us more hesitant to charge forward, because we understand the real consequences. War never ends. It's one of the questions that a character asks of mine at the very end. What war ever really ends? You can declare victory, but you will have thousands of people walking around, and for decades they are still in that war. And we've seen it in the United States, those soldiers who have come back from Iraq and Afghanistan. You see it everywhere. You've seen it in Vietnam.
And I think that's a brilliant place to sort of leave it here. Before we end this talk, that idea that, you know, these things, these repetitions of war are going to keep coming back if we don't completely change our mentalities, as you say, about conflict and about the way that people are treated, and ownership and placement and land and all of these things that inspire war. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you so much, Maaza.
So much. Thank you, everyone. Thank you.
I urge you all to get a copy of this amazing book. Thank you again, Maaza.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Jess. It was a pleasure.
Yeah.